The tires crunched over loose gravel as the old Ford truck came to a slow stop in front of a brick building with faded green shutters. A rusted sign read, "Crestwood Retirement and Rehabilitation Center." Underneath it, in smaller letters, "Where care meets dignity." Daniel Burke, 82, stared out the passenger window in silence. His cane rested across his lap. His back ached slightly from the long drive. But what hurt more was the way his son hadn't said a word in over 20 minutes. Alan, his only child, put the truck in park and let out a breath that was too heavy to be casual. "Well, we're here," Alan mumbled, glancing away. Daniel turned his head slowly. "Is this a doctor's appointment I don't know about?" Alan didn't answer. Instead, he opened the glove box, pulled out a manila folder and held it toward Daniel. "They've got all your paperwork ready. Just need your signature when you get in. It's the best place in the county, I swear." Daniel didn't move, didn't reach for the folder, didn't even blink. He just watched his son, the same boy he'd taught to fix tractors and trim wheat rows, slowly turn into a stranger. 3 days earlier, they had shared breakfast on the farmhouse porch. Alan had brought his wife Julie and their teenage daughter. Julie had made pancakes. She even added blueberries like Marlene used to. Daniel remembered thinking it felt almost like old times. But now, sitting in this truck, he saw it for what it was, a farewell brunch in disguise. Alan cleared his throat. "Look, Dad, you've had a few close calls lately. You left the hose on all night last week. You forgot the barn door open. Julie's worried sick. I'm just trying to do what's best." Daniel's jaw tightened. "The hose, huh?" he said quietly. "That your excuse?" "I'm not making excuses," Alan said, voice rising. "You've run that farm for 50 years, but you're not 50 anymore. You need rest, real care. These people know how to handle old men." Alan looked away again. Daniel took a deep breath. "You think a fancy mattress and a nurse with a clipboard is care?" he asked. "Care is when someone listens, when they ask what you want. You didn't ask, Alan. You decided." Alan's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "I'm sorry, okay? I'm doing this for your safety." Daniel let out a short laugh, dry as autumn wind. "No, son, you're doing this for the land." Alan didn't deny it, didn't even look surprised. 10 minutes later, Daniel sat alone in the intake office. A cheerful woman handed him a clipboard with forms, pointing at the highlighted lines, but Daniel didn't read them. He simply reached into his coat pocket and felt the edge of something firm, something old and familiar. A folded envelope. Inside it, the original land deed to the 46-acre Burke farm, signed, notarized, untouched. They thought he'd left everything behind. They were wrong. That night, as he lay on a stiff mattress in a quiet room that smelled like antiseptic and loneliness, Daniel stared at the ceiling tiles and smiled faintly. He wasn't done yet. They'd taken his front porch, but not his power, and they were about to learn what happens when a man who built everything from nothing decides to take it back. 2 weeks passed. Daniel Burke adjusted quickly, but not in the way Alan had expected. The nurses at Crestwood noted how independent he was. He walked the halls each morning, nodded politely to the other residents, and always refused assistance unless it was truly necessary. He never raised his voice, never caused trouble, but behind those quiet eyes, wheels were turning. Every day after breakfast, Daniel would sit by the glass doors that overlooked the back garden, a small patch of green fenced off from the main courtyard. There, an old maintenance worker tended roses and trimmed hedges with steady hands and no nonsense. Daniel liked that. One morning he pushed open the doors and stepped onto the gravel path. "You always this early?" the gardener asked, glancing up beneath his wide-brimmed hat. Daniel offered a half-smile. "Habit of old farmers. Can't sleep past sunrise." The man chuckled. "You don't look like most of the folks they stick in here." "I'm not like most." Daniel reached down, ran his fingers over the soil, and nodded approvingly. Nice work. You mulch with cedar chips. The man looked surprised. Yeah, helps with the ants. They exchanged names. Clint Rogers, 67, ex-carpenter turned groundskeeper after retirement got boring. They talked for nearly an hour that day. About soil, about storms, about how family changes once money is involved. Daniel never once mentioned Alan, but Clint understood anyway. That night Daniel pulled the deed from beneath his mattress. He laid it flat on the small desk in his room and reread every line, every signature. He thought of Alan's sudden concern, the way Julie had started attending farm management workshops behind his back, how they'd started locking the file cabinet when he wasn't home. And then, the key detail, his name was still on the deed. Because Daniel had never transferred full ownership, he'd only granted power of attorney for basic operations, temporarily. But Alan assumed age meant surrender. He assumed wrong. The next morning, Daniel approached Clint again. Ever drive past State Road 19? Clint raised an eyebrow. The one near that big cornfield. That's mine, Daniel said softly. 46 acres. Old farmhouse, 3 barns. Been in my family since Roosevelt. Clint whistled. No kidding. Daniel looked him in the eye. You still know a thing or two about construction. Enough. Good. I need a favor. Quiet one. Clint leaned on his shovel, nodding slowly. Go on. By evening, Clint had a copy of the deed, a list of notarized contacts Daniel trusted, and a timeline. Daniel wasn't moving back to the farm. Not yet. But he'd make sure that when the final harvest came, Alan wouldn't be holding the scythe. The first letter went out that Friday morning. Daniel had written it by hand, his cursive still neat after all these years. No lawyers involved yet. Just a letter from a father to an old friend, Luther Banks, a retired title officer and fishing buddy from decades ago. The kind of man who understood that land wasn't just property, it was legacy. Inside the envelope, Daniel enclosed a copy of the deed and a short message. Need your help verifying boundaries and re-registering the title. Quietly. Time is short. Trust remains. He sealed the letter, handed it to Clint during his morning garden walk, and nodded once. No one at Crestwood paid any attention. An elderly man handing a note to a gardener was hardly suspicious, but it was the beginning of a storm. Meanwhile, back at the farmhouse, Alan and Julie had already begun light renovations. The barn had been cleared of old tools, boxes marked for donation were piling up in the garage, and a for sale sign had been ordered, though not yet planted in the ground. Alan had assumed it was only a matter of time before the paperwork would magically shift into full ownership. After all, his dad was out of the picture now, passive, tucked away. Alan had never been good at reading silence. One afternoon, Julie walked in from the mailbox holding a sleek envelope with a gold trim. She looked puzzled. "Did you order this?" she asked. Alan looked up from his laptop. "No, who's it from?" She read the label aloud. Burke County Clerk's Office, Property Review Notice. His face paled. "Open it." Inside was a simple update. A change in inquiry status had been registered regarding the Burke property title. It didn't mention specifics, but it did say one thing clearly. A new ownership verification process had been initiated by Mr. Daniel Burke. Alan stared at the letter. "He can't do that. He's not even living here." Julie frowned. "His name's still on the paperwork, isn't it?" Alan didn't answer, but his silence said everything. Back at Crestwood, Daniel was reading a gardening book when Clint returned from his daily lunch break. "It's moving," Clint said quietly, slipping into the seat beside him on the courtyard bench. "Luther," Clint nodded, "says the title's under re-review. Should slow down any sale process by at least 60 days, especially with a contested claim." Daniel nodded slowly. "That'll buy me time." Clint glanced around. "You sure you want to do this?" could just confront him. Daniel looked up, eyes steady, and let him control the story. No, I want him to walk into his own trap, same way he walked me into that truck. That evening, Daniel began drafting another letter, this time to Elaine Carter, a former legal secretary from his days on the county's zoning board. She still owed him a favor. By the time he folded the envelope shut, his hands felt lighter. The fight wasn't loud, but it was working, because the best kind of revenge is written in silence and recorded in ink. On a breezy Sunday afternoon, Julie stood on the porch holding a white and blue real estate sign. Alan was pacing the driveway, phone pressed to his ear. "They said they need a clean title," he muttered. "No holds, no active review, nothing under dispute. How was I supposed to know Dad's signature wasn't the final step?" Julie tilted her head. "Maybe because he never gave you full ownership." Alan shot her a look. "He's not in his right mind." She hesitated. "He seemed fine last month. Sharp, just quiet." Alan's jaw clenched. "Well, he's not sharp anymore." But deep down he was rattled. The paperwork hadn't gone through. The appraiser had postponed. The realtor was cautious. And worst of all, the county clerk's message was clear. Until ownership is settled, no sale will be processed. Inside Crestwood, Daniel was sitting in the activity room, not playing cards, not watching TV, just listening. He had overheard the nurses chatting about a call from someone asking for his mental health records. Julie. He smiled faintly. She was trying to build a case, prove he was unstable, try to claim power over the estate under incompetency. Too late. Daniel had seen it coming weeks ago. That's why he had mailed Elaine Carter not just the deed, but also a notarized letter from Dr. Avery, his longtime physician, who'd recently given him a clean cognitive bill of health, all dated, stamped and filed. Clint found him by the fountain that evening. "She's digging," he said simply. Daniel chuckled. "She'll need a deep shovel." Clint pulled a folded slip of paper from his back pocket. "Elaine says the clerk's office formally froze the transaction rights on the farm. Legally, nothing moves unless you approve it now." Daniel nodded, calm as always. "She says we can assign a successor title holder too," Clint added. "Want me to draft the form?" "Yes," Daniel said, "but not just anyone." He pulled from his wallet a worn photo. Daniel standing beside a young man in coveralls, taken years ago in front of the barn. The young man's name Victor Tran, a former apprentice turned close friend, who had once been homeless until Daniel took him in and taught him how to work the land. Victor had called every year on Daniel's birthday. Alan hadn't. By nightfall a new form was filed. Title succession would pass not to Alan but to Victor, effective immediately upon Daniel's consent, or triggered automatically if any unauthorized sale attempt was made. It was airtight and poetic, because where Alan saw the land as a cash-out, Victor saw it as home. The following morning, Julie walked out onto the porch again, holding the real estate sign, but something stopped her. A letter on the welcome mat. No return address, just one line written neatly on the envelope. "The farm already has an heir. You're standing on borrowed ground." She dropped the sign, and for the first time since Daniel had been driven away, she felt the ground shift beneath her feet. It was just after 10 a.m. when Alan's phone rang. He was at the kitchen table, sipping reheated coffee and browsing through top tips to sell farmland fast. Julie was upstairs on a video call with a decorator, still hoping, foolishly, to turn Daniel's rustic charm into a Pinterest-perfect listing. Caller ID read, First Valley Trust. Alan frowned but answered. "Mr. Burke," the voice on the other end said. "This is Randall Hobbs, Managing Officer for First Valley. I'm calling regarding your recent inquiry to refinance the Burke property." Alan sat up straighter. "Yes, that's right. I'm afraid we can't proceed," the man said bluntly. Alan blinked. "Why not?" "There's a hold on the deed. The county's flagged it as under legal review, and the succession form has already been initiated. with a different beneficiary. Alan froze. What? What beneficiary? I'm not at liberty to share that detail, unless you are the legal owner on file, which, at this moment, you are not. The line went quiet. Then Hobbs added, also I'd advise against further appraisals. Until the title clears, the property can't legally be listed or leveraged. Click. Alan stared at his phone in disbelief. Julie walked in moments later, excited. I just sent our decorator pictures of the front porch. She says it's got that vintage Americana look. What? Alan slammed his phone on the table. He gave the farm away. Julie blinked. To who? I don't know. The bank wouldn't say. Can he even do that? He's still on the deed, Julie. He never gave us full control. We thought he would. That's the difference. Julie stood in silence, then quietly sat down. So we just lose it. Alan didn't answer, but the crack in his voice said everything. Back at Crestwood, Daniel sat in the garden with Clint and handed him an envelope. Send this to Victor, he said. It's time. Inside was the formal grant of primary ownership, with Daniel retaining residential rights but transferring operational control of the land, the farmhouse, and its assets. Victor had earned it with years of loyalty and hard work. Alan had expected it by birthright. One built a life from it. The other tried to inherit a shortcut. Later that day, Nurse Carla wheeled Daniel back to his room and paused at the door. You've had quite a few visitors asking about you lately, she said, smiling, but you never seem surprised. Daniel chuckled softly. Because I know who's coming and who's just pretending. She tilted her head. So what now, Mr. Burke? He looked around the modest room, then at the window, where sunlight poured through and lit up the picture of the farmhouse taped to the glass. Now, he said, now I let them stew in the silence they once gave me. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at Crestwood in a plain envelope. Inside was a short handwritten note, folded neatly, along with a photo, the Burke farmhouse, newly painted, the front porch restored, and flower beds blooming along the railing. Daniel smiled as he read, It's all intact. I'm taking care of it like you did. The land breathes better now. You always have a room here, not a basement. Victor Daniel folded the letter with care, slid it into the drawer beside his bed, and exhaled slowly. It wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about being seen, respected, remembered. Something his own son had long forgotten how to offer. That Friday, Clint rolled Daniel out to the pickup truck he'd borrowed from a friend. Daniel wore a clean button-down shirt, slacks, and his old wide-brimmed farm hat. What's the occasion? One of the nurses asked. Daniel leaned on his cane, his voice calm. Just going to see what survived the storm. The drive to the farm was quiet and warm. Fields rolled by, golden and green, like the pages of an old photo album. Clint kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly near the dash, like he was steering more than just a truck. He was carrying a legacy. As they pulled up to the gate, Daniel saw the new sign, Burke Homestead, St. 1948, and beneath it, in smaller letters, Caretaker, Victor Tran. Victor stood on the porch with a mug of coffee and a wide smile. Daniel stepped out slowly, letting the gravel crunch beneath his feet like it used to. He climbed the steps with Victor's help and looked around. The porch had been reinforced, the barn doors repainted, and the oak tree near the driveway had been trimmed just enough to let the sunset hit the front stoop. Everything was cared for, every detail remembered. Inside, the living room smelled faintly of cedar and old books. Daniel's favorite chair, the one Alan had sent to storage, now sat by the window, perfectly reupholstered. Victor handed him a small box. Inside was the original house key, still marked with Daniel's initials, polished but unchanged. I figured it should come back to you, Victor said. Daniel closed the box gently. You keep it, he replied. You've earned it. Victor hesitated. You sure? Daniel looked around the house, the silence now full, not empty. I've seen what it looks like when the wrong people hold the key. As dusk settled, Daniel stepped back out onto the porch. The same porch Alan had once mocked as outdated, now rebuilt, restored, and more alive than ever. And in that quiet he felt no anger, only a lesson sealed by time. The deepest betrayal is silence, but the most powerful revenge is knowing you gave the future to someone who didn't ask, only earned. Word travels fast in small counties, and when Alan received a letter from the county recorder's office confirming the full transfer of property rights to Victor Tran, he thought it was a mistake, a clerical glitch. Surely this couldn't be permanent. He and Julie drove straight to Crestwood the next morning, not with flowers or warm greetings, but with a manila folder and fire in their eyes. Daniel was in the courtyard, sipping coffee with Clint when they arrived. Julie approached first, trying a softer tone. "Dad, we're just here to clear up some confusion." Alan didn't wait. "You gave it away," he barked, "to a stranger." Daniel looked at his son, the same son who had promised to protect the family name, then pushed his father into a basement and tried to sell the land behind his back. He took a breath, calm, centered. "I gave it to someone who knows the value of sweat, who knocks before entering, who didn't see me as a burden." Julie crossed her arms. "You didn't even tell us." Daniel's smile was faint. "You didn't tell me before you loaded up the truck and dropped me off here either." Alan's face turned red. "This is theft." "No," Daniel said quietly. "What you tried to do was theft. This is restoration." He turned to Clint. "Would you go get the envelope from my nightstand?" Inside the envelope was Daniel's final will, recently updated, legally notarized. Alan and Julie opened it together, hands trembling. They read the first few lines aloud. "To those who tried to silence me when I was vulnerable, I leave nothing but memory. To those who stood by me without asking, I leave everything I still had left to give." And there it was, in black ink and bold type, all remaining accounts, life insurance and personal assets to be transferred to Victor Tran, with a small education trust left for his future children. Julie gasped. "The life insurance too." Alan stared, speechless. Daniel stood slowly, hands resting on the back of the wooden bench. "You built a future around what you thought I owed you," he said. "Victor built one by showing me what I still meant." The conversation ended there, not with shouting, not with lawsuits, but with two people walking away, not disinherited, but dismantled, and an old man returning to his coffee, with his pride intact. Autumn rolled in quietly, wrapping the farmland in gold and rust. The trees along the Burke property dropped their leaves one by one, carpeting the drive in a soft, crackling hush. The farmhouse, now freshly painted and humming with quiet purpose, stood like a living memory, rooted in soil and story. Victor was settling in. He rose early, fed the chickens, checked the fences, and met with a local ag co-op about restoring the vegetable patch near the back barn. The land responded to him, not because he demanded it, but because he respected it. Daniel had returned just once, briefly, not to reclaim it, but to bless it. Back at Crestwood, Daniel's room looked different now. The framed deed had been replaced with a photo of the farmhouse porch, Victor standing proudly beside the rebuilt railings. The nurses checked in more often, not because he needed extra care, but because his story had made the rounds. Quiet strength had a way of echoing down corridors. One afternoon, Nurse Carla brought in a young volunteer, a college student studying social work. "He wanted to ask you about resilience," she said. "I told him you'd lived it." Daniel chuckled. "You want to hear about resilience?" he asked, motioning the young man closer. "I'll tell you this, it's not in how loud you shout or how many times you punch back. Real strength is when they think they've buried you, but you're just getting ready to grow roots." Victor visited every Saturday without fail. Sometimes they talked shop. Other times they sat in companionable silence, watching football or drinking cider on the back lawn. One day, Victor brought his son, a toddler with big eyes and an even bigger curiosity. Daniel leaned over and handed him a small carved wooden truck. "Made this when Alan was your age," he said. "He never liked it much." Victor smiled gently. "He will." Daniel looked down at the boy, then back up at Victor. "This land was never about keeping it in the family," he said. "It was about keeping it in the hands of someone who acted like family." That winter, as snow dusted the windowsill, Daniel wrote one last letter, a quiet note to himself, tucked into a journal by his bedside. "They moved me to a room with no sunlight. Thought I'd forget the smell of my own dirt, but I took the key with me. And when the time came, I passed it on to someone who knocked. And so the porch light at the Burke farmhouse stayed on, not waiting for Daniel to return, but glowing in thanks for the man who made sure home wasn't something you inherited. It was something you earned."